It is good to be here with all of you. And we are, so today is Tisha B'Av, and we welcome again my brother, Josh Shuki Hartuv. If you have questions for him during the tour, I invite you to please feel free to put it into the chat at any time. For those of you who haven't been here before, to tell you a little bit about my brother, Josh made Aliyah in 2011. He served in the IDF and Israel's Defense Forces in the Tzanchanim, the paratrooping unit. He lived on Kibbutz Sa'ad for a number of years, graduated from Israel's tour guide course, has guided a number of our families. And again, one of the things that I love is, even though there are times where I, as his older brother, will purport to be wiser or have more years under my belt, every time Josh teaches me something amazing and new that I never knew or never thought about before. And is just both an expert tour guide, and we also, if it weren't Tisha B'Av, we'd be having a lot of fun planning these things together and developing these tours and working together, and we really enjoy it. So I'm going to pass it off to him, other than just to say that on Tisha B'Av, it's a day of remembering the greatest tragedies that happened to our people, a day of trying to sit with that sadness and grapple with that sadness, to think about what does it mean to go through both tragic moments, to walk through exile, and then as Tisha B'Av begins to end, to rebuild. And right now we are in exactly that transition moment, the day of Tisha B'Av. I think it's both a great moment for us with the exact timing, and it's also helpful that Josh doesn't have to stay up until 4 in the morning. But we are at the point of Tisha B'Av where we're right at around Mincha Gdolah, right around the time where we have left morning and get to the afternoon part. And that's a time where a lot of the restrictions of Tisha B'Av begin to get lifted. It's a time where we're just on the border of still just being sad to being sad and thinking about how we rebuild. And during this tour that Josh is going to give, we're going to hear about some of the most tragic, most devastating moments in Jewish history, and it's specifically around Jerusalem, to witness how those moments translate to exile, moments of tragedy and exile, and how after that in exile there is a way to rebuild and how we move forward. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to Josh Hartuv.
Oh, all right, everyone. Hi. It's nice to, I guess I'm allowed to say it's nice to see everyone, right? Because Tisha B'Av ended. I already broke my fast. So it's nice to see all of you guys. It must not be nice for you to see me, I guess. But it's nice to see you all once again. I think is this the 3rd or 4th tour that we've done together? I can't even remember now. So it's been quite a few, and I cherish every single one that we get to do. With you, David, but also with Anshe Emet, with the community that you have here. It's always really fun to log on a couple minutes early and do a little bit of kibitzing with everyone. Not that today's kibitzing was very solemn and not fun at all. But welcome everyone to the Tisha B'Av tour. So again, my name is Josh, and I'll be with you guys for the next hour or so. And let's already get started with the show. Let's already get started with everything. Where the idea of the tour today, because I think that most of you have already done a bunch of these tours already before. So the idea behind the tour today is that we're trying to understand what happened with the Babylonian exile. What happened with the Jews who came from the area from Jerusalem in 586 BCE when the temple is destroyed, when Jerusalem is destroyed. What happened to all those people? What happened to the communities? Where did they go? What did they do? What did they build? Did they survive? Did they thrive? Well, what's the deal here with the Jews who actually managed to get out from the Babylonian exile? So that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about. The other thing that we're going to be talking about is essentially just the utter destruction of the events that took place. And we're not just going to be speaking about the destruction of the temple in 586, but we're also going to be mentioning about a few other moments in Jewish history that we are commemorating on Tisha B'Av that relate to the areas that we are in. And where we're going to start today is actually not in the spot that I just opened up, but we're actually going to start today here in Lachish. Now, Lachish is an ancient site that in Lachish, where we are, just to understand a little bit about where we are. So here's Jerusalem, and this is the town of Lachish, where Lachish at its day, during its time in 700 BCE, and then again in 586 BCE, during the two major destructions of Jerusalem and not Jerusalem, of Judah and Israel, where we're going to talk about what those destructions were in just a second. But when Babylon comes down in 586 BCE, they come and they swoop down, they conquer the city of Lachish. Now, why am I bringing that up? Because when the archaeologists come and they dig in Lachish, they find a series of what's called pottery shards or ostrakhan. And on these pieces of pottery, there's all these little letters, these notes that people would write to each other. And this, as you can see from this text, for all of you who are really good Hebrew readers, you can tell that this is Hebrew. This is the ancient Hebrew script. And on one of these pottery shards has a really great story to it. And one that is talked about in the book of Yirmiyahu, in the book of Jeremiah, who mentions that the last two cities remaining before Jerusalem was destroyed was Lachish and Azekah, these two cities that are to the west of Jerusalem. But when they looked at the pottery shards found here in Lachish, they found that there was someone who was in between the two cities, between Lachish and Azekah, who sees Azekah burning and says, hey, you people of Lachish, watch out, you're next. For we cannot see Azekah anymore. So on the one hand, it's really interesting seeing, in a way, a list of cities like in Jeremiah saying, fine, Lachish was destroyed, Azekah was destroyed. These are the last two cities remaining. But it's another thing to see this real personal element to the story itself. And that's really the crux of what I'm going to try to get at here today, where we're looking at places like Lachish and like Jerusalem, which we're looking at right now, and trying to understand them not as a destruction of buildings or material things like cities, but as a loss of people and stories and culture, that it just can get wiped away. And that's really the sadness of Tisha B'Av. The thing that really always gets me on Tisha B'Av isn't necessarily just about learning about the destruction of the temple itself, but learning about the destruction of what could have been and what once was. And so to understand from that perspective already from Lachish and understanding this one person who's looking and seeing the destruction, the future destruction of Lachish, so now let's understand a little bit about Jerusalem as well. Where the original core of Jerusalem would have looked like this. The city of David, just here, this little tiny city that's on the hill, where this is what Jerusalem would have looked like, not just for the 300 years under the rulership of David and his descendants, but even before David under the Jebusite rule as well. And then Jerusalem at some point has to expand. In the year 701 BCE, oh, sorry, not that image, one second. Just trying to get the right image up. In 701 BCE, there is another big crisis that Jerusalem has to face, which is this other wave of destruction by the Assyrians, which come from the same area as Babylon, just a little bit north of Babylon. We're going to go there in just a few minutes. But the Assyrian destruction destroys all of Israel and all of Judah, and they surround the city of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was no longer this little tiny city on the hill that King David had built or had fortified, but Jerusalem had grown 3-4 times its size because it had welcomed in tens of thousands of refugees. And miraculously, Hezekiah, Chizkiyahu, and all the city of Jerusalem were spared of the Assyrian destruction, but that was the only city that was spared. I want to also just point out while we're over here and we're looking over Jerusalem. So again, this is what the first temple would have looked like, an idea of what the first temple would have looked like. We don't exactly know what it was. And here's another image of the second temple that's over here, where the second temple, when this is constructed between 20 BCE and 70 CE, when it is destroyed by the Romans. So the second temple was the largest building in the entire Roman Empire when it is destroyed. So we're not talking about the difference between these two temples is that the first temple, in a way, was probably a famous temple and an important temple that was maybe a tourist attraction for people in the area, but the second temple might have been the most famous building in the entire world. And which is just also interesting to keep things in perspective in that way, that we're talking about the buildings that we're talking about are not just buildings that are important to Judaism, but buildings that are important to world history. But again, the important things that I want to stress today are not necessarily about that building idea, that the buildings, we're sad about the buildings, so we're sad about the people. And the way to get sad about the people...
Can I just to clarify? So like first temple was built around 1000 BCE or so. It's lasting for a few hundred years until 586 BC when it's destroyed by the Babylonians. The first temple is, after it's been destroyed, is rebuilt in some way within about 100 years, but it's really expanded around 20 BCE. And that's when you're saying when the second temple structure is expanded in around 20 BC, that's when it's this probably largest temple structure in the world.
Right. Like, just not to get too in the nitty gritty of it, but basically Herod's temple, which is the more accurate way of saying it, not the second temple, you're right, is essentially actually the fourth temple. It's just that only the first one and Herod's temple were the ones that were violently destroyed. The second and third ones were just basically built. The third temple and the fourth temple were in a sense kind of built on the previous temples before. They kind of did a renovation in a way. So that's why we still call it the second temple. This is what we have in mind when we refer to it as the second temple, because temples number 2 and number 3 weren't really much to write home about. So that's a technical clarification about that. So what I wanted to make it a little bit personal feeling is, if you go from, this is the modern city of Jerusalem again, and if we cross the valley over here, we'll get towards the Begin Museum. Now, when the Begin Museum was being built, the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, when that was being built, because anywhere you stick a shovel in the land in Jerusalem, you're going to come up with something. And so what are the things that they come up with? They find a first temple, they find a first temple burial tomb, where you can see this man who was lying down, essentially where someone would have been lying for 12 months after they passed away, where you can see the little places where the head is placed. So a body in the first temple period would have been left on essentially like a table like this for 12 months. And then afterwards, the bones would be put underneath in a pit, presumably with family or with the town or whatever it was. Now, generally in these first temple burial tombs, what's found isn't just bones, but also necklaces and jewelry and things, whether it's food that the person liked or whatever it is, to go with the dead bodies. But what is interesting about the ones that they found in the Begin Museum was that they found one of the tombs with this. Where, if any of you have been to Jerusalem before and had Hadaya jewelry, this is in a way the first Hadaya necklace. Or what is it? This is a silver scroll, where etched in the silver, you can see all of these, the ancient Hebrew script, just like what we saw before in Lachish. So you see this ancient Hebrew script. Now, when you look at the Hebrew script, you can translate it over to modern Hebrew script to read it a little bit better. And what is written on this little tiny silver scroll that was someone's necklace? Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'yichunecha. What is this text that's over here? This is the Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing. And this necklace was found next to a burial pit that was soldiers that were protecting the city of Jerusalem during the siege, the Babylonian siege in 586. And essentially this is someone, a young man presumably, who is wearing this necklace and hoping to get some kind of protection. This good luck charm that maybe his family member gave to him in order to survive this Babylonian siege. And if there's anything that makes you feel kind of connected to someone, well, now when you say the Birkat Kohanim, you can think about that soldier that was there protecting the city of Jerusalem and eventually ends up being buried just outside of the old city. This text, just so you know, is actually the oldest ever found biblical text ever found. This is 500 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls are dated to, even though the Dead Sea Scrolls is a lot more comprehensive, obviously, and far more, this is the oldest biblical text ever found. And just to fast forward from 586 BCE, the Babylonian destruction, to the Roman destruction, again, you can see from the southern end of the Western Wall, the Robinson's Arch, what used to be essentially the main interchange that allowed for people to go up to the Temple Mount Plaza, which, just to understand a little bit what the Temple Mount would have looked like then, you have Robinson's Arch that's over here, and this is the pink part, it's the Kotel of today. The yellow is the Kodesh HaKodeshim of the Holy of Holies of the temple, of the second temple. Now, we're looking at all of this, and you can see the mass destruction of the city. You can see that the stones that came from Robinson's Arch created such a dent in the ground that's over here and you can see the size of the boulders just on the side over there. And with that, I'm going to pass the floor over to my brother, David.
So we learn in the Mishnah from about 2,000 years ago that Chamisha Dvarim Eru et Avotenu b'Tisha B'Av, that 5 misfortunes befell our ancestors on the 9th day of Av. So what were the 5 things? Nigzar Avotenu shelo yikansu la'aretz, in the book of Numbers, where our ancestors were told that they would never enter the land of Israel. That the first and second temples were both destroyed, right? The first temple in 586 BCE and the second temple in 70 CE. That Beitar was captured in the 2nd century when Bar Kokhba was trying to revolt against the Romans. That Beitar was captured and destroyed. The Nechrasha Ha'ir. And that was also the day when also the city of Jerusalem was plowed and destroyed with the destruction of the Second Temple. So there's a lot of debate within rabbinic literature about, did these things actually happen on that date? For instance, Josh just showed you the rubble from the destruction. For such a massive building to have been destroyed, our rabbis have this debate. What does it mean? At what point is the building destroyed? When they first damage the building, when the building's on fire, when it's crumbling down? And what our rabbis effectively get to is, if we were going to have a day of mourning, a day of fasting for every day that something bad happened in the history of the Jewish people, we would probably have a fast day every day. So that's where they concentrated fast days into one fast day. So what our rabbis don't want is for us to be in a state of mourning every day, but instead they say, let's take all these fast days which happened around this time and we put it on Tisha B'Av, and that continues through the rest of Jewish history. We commemorate the expulsion from Spain on Tisha B'Av, even though that took a process of many months. Various things related to expulsions and massacres and pogroms are often placed on Tisha B'Av. Those are the keynote, the lamentations that we recite are often for different commemorations that we recite through history. So when we think about Tisha B'Av, I want to build on what Josh said. On the one hand, we're talking about the destruction of a building, of a place, and we're also talking about what those places mean. So in the cases of the temples, it's not only the loss of a building, not only the loss of the center of ritual life of sacrifices, but it's also the destruction of courts, of schools, of the economic center, the deaths of whether it's soldiers or innocent people. That's what we're commemorating when we're looking at Tisha B'Av, and it happens throughout the centuries and the millennia, going back to the time of our ancestors in the desert, 2,000 years, around the year 1000, 1300 BCE, to a temple in 586, to a temple in 70 CE, until today when we commemorate more recent destructions. So Tisha B'Av is really about these destructions that have happened over the millennia. Josh, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, so, and we're going to talk about a couple of those throughout. And just to give just one last little bit to make you really depressed about the Jerusalem destruction from the Roman destruction is to, and I'm going to pass the floor back to David in just a second, is to look at the underground, underneath the city of David, where underneath the city of David there is this whole essentially drainage canal, this sewer, essentially the sewer of Jerusalem, where Josephus, the Roman Jewish historian, writes about this exact drainage pipe, essentially, that when the Romans go into Jerusalem and they start basically slaughtering people left, right, and center, so many people naturally go to hide. And they hide in caverns, they hide in caves, and they hide in places all around the city. And one of the major places that they were hiding in was in this drainage canal. And I'll turn the floor over to David to understand, not just from Josephus' point of view, which you could read over here, but also from the Talmudic perspective of what took place, about what happened here according to the rabbis in the Talmud, from the Jerusalem Talmud.
Yeah, well, and one of the things that I know, certainly when I first was learning about Tisha B'Av, I feel like it was often about the destruction of temples, but not about the horrible massacres to people. So I want to just warn people that this is a bit of a gruesome text. Our rabbis, especially in the Jerusalem Talmud, Ta'anit, share a number of stories that are gruesome, that really evoke feelings or stories that are similar to ones that maybe we have heard some of the most devastating stories of the Holocaust or of different massacres and pogroms from the last 100 or so years. And in this particular story, they talk about how the Romans pursued people and killed them until streams filled with blood. So if a horse crossed it, the blood went up to the horse's nose. And the blood was streaming with such force that it overturned stones the size of 40 seah until the water went 4 miles into the sea. They really evoke, I mean, when we say in English, the streets were filled with blood for the rabbis, this sounded literal. That they are telling this story probably 100 or 200 years after the destruction. And the way that they heard the stories were that the destruction and devastation was so brutal and so devastating that blood was able to actually overturn rocks, and not just small rocks, but these big stones that Josh was talking about. Now, these aren't firsthand accounts if they're appearing in the Jerusalem Talmud. This is probably written around 200 or 300 CE, but the story is meant to evoke something that we're not just talking about something small or the destruction of a bit of a building, but when we hear about the destructions of the temples, we're talking also about the Romans murdering and pillaging the Jewish community. And the devastation, what it meant to kill almost an entire generation of the Jewish people, and for it to really be a massacre.
And the one final note about it is that when the archaeologists dug underneath here in these canals that Josephus was mentioning, and you get that image of the blood going through the canals in a way, so when the archaeologists are digging here, they find lamps. Now, a lamp is a weird thing to find in a drainage canal. A lamp says that this is someone who knows, maybe it was a grandmother or grandfather who's reading, a little bit of a book, or trying to see their grandchildren in these drainage canals, just trying to see one last little bit of light hiding away from the Romans. And so it's not just the lamps that were found also, but as well weapons and the spearheads and swords and big stones like this that the Romans would use, and also smashed, rocks and stairs that show that the Romans went into these drainage canals to seek out the last few hiding Jews that were there from the year 70, from that destruction. So it's a really, really devastating period, and one that of course, again, evokes these images not just of the destruction of the temple, but you think of people hiding in the Warsaw Ghetto. You think of people hiding in various different places from different pogroms throughout Jewish history. And with that, we're going to actually now leave Jerusalem, where we've gone now. If we take a look at our handy dandy map over here, so we've gone now from Jerusalem, and we're going all the way up to the north. We're going back to the 586 BCE, to the Babylonian exile, and we're going all the way up north, and we're crossing the Jordan River. This is a bridge that you can still cross to this day into the Golan Heights. And we're crossing the Golan Heights and continuing to go further east until we eventually get to Damascus. And this is really the next part of the tour, where we've now understood what the devastation and destruction was on Tisha B'Av, but let's understand what the people did. So what did the people do? They get to a place like Damascus, and first let's just understand a little bit about what we're going to do for the next little bit. Because we're going to follow along on this map, where we're going to start from Damascus and follow in a few different sites. Some of them I have to skip, some of them I did with different tours, but that's besides the point. We're going to keep on walking around from Damascus in Syria, head to Lebanon, go all the way up to Turkey, go back into Syria over here, following that golden horseshoe until we get to this place, the Stura Europos. And then afterwards, from there, we're going to go into Iraq. And so this is understanding what these Jewish communities were like at the time, where the most important synagogue in Damascus is this synagogue over here, which is known as the Jobar Synagogue, which is on the eastern side of Damascus, where this synagogue, we call the Jobar Synagogue because it's part of this neighborhood called Jobar in Damascus, but they called it the Eliyahu Navi Synagogue. Now, if you look at this synagogue over here, it looks like a synagogue in Tzfat. It's got blue, it's got the hanging lights, it's got couches all the way around it. You can see it's really stunning and all the beautiful things in there, and you're not wrong if you say it looks like Tzfat, because the iteration that we're seeing right now is what was built in around the year 1500, around when all those synagogues in Tzfat were built. However, like most synagogues that we're visiting right now that we're going to see on this tour, even though what we're seeing is from the 1500s, this was a synagogue that was here long before that, where maybe this synagogue goes back to the 2nd or 3rd century CE, which is by far not the oldest synagogue that we're going to be visiting today. And what's special about it is that in this synagogue, this Jobar synagogue, why is it called Eliyahu Hanavi synagogue? Because next to the Aron Kodesh, there's this secret door that's over here. Now this door leads upstairs and goes into a cave, which is known as Eliyahu's cave, Elijah the prophet's cave, where according to the Syrian tradition, Eliyahu, when escaping from Achav, the king of Israel, the wicked king of Israel who was coming to chase Eliyahu, he hides in this cave. And later on, he anoints the next prophet to come after him, Elisha. So it's an incredibly important cave in Jewish history, especially for the Syrian Jews who bring those traditions to this spot, which again gives the credence to the synagogue being here that dates back even long before the Babylonian exile. We're talking about around the year 900 BCE. This is 400 years before the Babylonian exiles would arrive. So what's really interesting about this is that this is also, because of this tradition of Eliyahu and Elisha being here, it became an important place for refugees who would come and seek comfort, especially from the Spanish Inquisition. But even more interestingly was that for centuries and centuries, the Jews of Syria, if they were sick, ill, had some kind of ailment or whatever it was, they would come and sleep the night in the synagogue here in hopes that Elisha would be able to place his hands, the prophet Elisha could place his hands on them and heal them back to 100% life. And the way that it looks now is this. This is the synagogue of Jobar as it is nowadays, after essentially it was caught in the crossfires of a few different battles in Damascus during the Syrian civil war that is still ongoing. Here, I'm not going to stop for too long, but I just wanted to mention really quickly about the city of Sidon, or Sidon, in Lebanon, which has this beautiful, stunning view over here of the old city, and you can see into the new city as well, where we're sitting right outside of the tomb of Zebulun. And the reason why I wanted to bring you here to this tomb of Zebulun was just because the Jews of Sidon were so close spiritually and physically, geographically to Israel that they kept only one day of Yom Tov. They didn't do 2 days of Yom Tov when the holidays came around, because this was essentially part of the Promised Land. So again, this is a place where the areas that we're visiting right now are places where there's been continuous Jewish settlements, sometimes even long before the Babylonian exile. And it's only when the Babylonian exile comes around that a new wave of Jews comes to these areas and essentially brings all these other, all these new people and all these new ideas to the region. And so with a place like Sidon, which is so close, they really do consider themselves and did consider themselves part of the greater Israel area, really part of Israel. And so now we've actually gone from Damascus to Sidon, and we've done a really big trek all the way up north to southern Turkey into Sardis. Now, this is really just a one-of-a-kind synagogue. This is one that is absolutely mind-blowingly beautiful. And you can see the model of the synagogue in the Beit HaTfutzot Museum, the Diaspora Museum in Tel Aviv. This is what the synagogue would have looked like over here. You can see stunning mosaic floors that have been saved in various museums. This is what the synagogue would have looked like when the archaeologists came here in 1962 to start digging up the place. Now, why am I showing you this synagogue? Not just because it's really beautiful, but because there's a few really interesting features, and one that actually relates to our Yam Liyam tour. So whoever was with our Yam Liyam tour, doing the Sea to Sea tour, what do you notice cool that's about the architecture of the synagogue here? Does anyone notice anything interesting? I don't know, you can shout it out in the chat or whatever. So what do you notice here that might be similar to our Sea to Sea tour? Do you guys remember when we went to Pekin? In Pekin, in the ancient synagogue in Pekin, there was this image of the Beit HaMikdash, the image of the Holy of Holies that dates back to the time of the Second Temple, to Herod's temple, with these twisting pillars. And if you notice, this synagogue also has these twisting pillars. These are uniquely Jewish pillars that are in this synagogue. And to make it feel even more special in that kind of way, to show how amazing this community was, it's not just that they built these pillars to look like the Second Temple, but that they all match each other. There's 4 pillars that match. All the pillars all around the sides all match, which means that these were all brand new pillars made for this synagogue, which is incredibly rare in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century when these kinds of buildings were built, when usually it would be an old Roman temple that had fallen apart and they use secondhand some of the pillars, some of the bricks, some of the whatever. That's all over any synagogue, any church, and even mosques all over the Levant. You'll see all these kinds of things. But this synagogue here in southern Turkey, in Sardis, Turkey, which is a community that is noted by Josephus as well as being incredibly, incredibly wealthy Jewish community, that they built this synagogue from scratch for themselves. And even though this synagogue is from the 2nd century or 3rd century CE, what we're seeing now, it is built on a synagogue that existed before that. It exists on a synagogue that maybe goes to the 2nd or 3rd century BCE, making it one of the oldest synagogues in the world. And the other synagogue that we're going to go into now is we've now gone back into Syria, and now we're in the ancient synagogue of Aleppo. With the Aleppo synagogue, I'm not going to get into too many details about it, other than to show you the model of the synagogue. Now we know at the very least that the Aleppo synagogue, this is where the Aleppo Codex was found, which is this incredibly important historical document. It's the oldest biblical text found other than the Dead Sea Scrolls, which dates back to the 8th century CE. Now this synagogue we know dates back to at least then, maybe it goes back a little bit before that. There's a Syrian local tradition that the synagogue was originally built by King David's captain Yoav when around 950 BCE. But obviously that's more tradition than it is history, but who cares? You know, it's all the same thing. But let's look over here and look at this synagogue that we're looking at. What's interesting about it is that there's this outdoor courtyard, and that the synagogue in Aleppo, it's not unique because there are a few shuls from this time period that have this feature, but they would daven outside when the weather was nice. And inside, there's 2 buildings that also have these different chapels. And what's amazing about it isn't just that they had a nice, good weather and a bad weather synagogue. But the bad weather synagogue was really a bad weather, not just about weather, but about what's going on in the Jewish world. Where one of these bad weather times was 1492. During the Spanish Inquisition, when Spanish Jews are fleeing all over the Mediterranean, and the place that they find the most at home is in the Ottoman Empire, all the way in the east on the other side of the Mediterranean. And Aleppo, the Jewish community of Aleppo, welcomed in thousands of Spanish Jews into their community. And originally they would have davened all together, they would have prayed all together. But it would have been a problem because one person who leads is the Syrian style, one person who leads is the Sephardi style. The 2 aren't necessarily the same thing. People are going to argue. So what do? They separate the communities, and they utilize the big space of the kind of like Anshe Emet having 2 different minyanim, right? So they have 2 different minyanim here, but they have the Spanish minyan here, and they have the Syrian minyan here, and then afterwards they all come together for Kiddush. And that is, again, one of these themes throughout this tour, is that from this great tragedy of the Spanish Inquisition, where thousands of Jews would have been massacred, from the Roman destruction, from the Babylonian destruction, all of these people that survived, that managed to survive, that had to flee, that had to go to other places, so they had to find a home. And usually they were able to find a place that welcomed them in. And especially in this region, in this area, this is a place that is defined by the character of welcoming in the refugees, welcoming in those people from the outside. And now we've gone to a place that is called the Dura Europos Synagogue. Now this is just a really, really special place. Now why is it so special? It's so special that Google Maps doesn't even allow me to have any place that is, maybe Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan got his idea from Aleppo. Oh, maybe that's true. And Brian says it's a COVID-friendly shul. That's true. How recent are these pictures? Aleppo was a center of destruction during the Civil War. The Aleppo synagogue has actually managed to survive because the city of Aleppo, they care about some of these historical places. And so the Aleppo synagogue hasn't been completely demolished. And actually, where we saw it right now is basically as it generally is right now. So we've now moved from Aleppo. We've made our longest trek yet all the way to the Dura Europos Synagogue. But to save a little bit of time, Google Maps didn't let us actually get into the Dura Europos Synagogue. We're actually somewhere a little bit further north because this is the closest we could get. But we are on the Tigris River, which is one of the famous rivers of Mesopotamia in this Golden Horseshoe. Now, why is this place so special, this Tigris River, this Dura Europos Synagogue? Because it is the most beautiful ancient synagogue ever built. You wouldn't know it from the way it looks now, where now this is basically what it's been a weapons cache under ISIS, where you can see it from here, you can see it from here as well, where it's basically empty. But luckily, because of its magnificent beauty and the incredible, incredible frescoes that were in the background, so that were on the walls, the Damascus Museum preserved it. This is as it stands right now in the Damascus Museum, where you can see all these stunning, stunning frescoes. Now, for any of you with a keen eye, you'll notice that all these frescoes that are over here, they look really similar to the frescoes that are behind me over here. Now, it's no accident. Obviously, I made it my background, so of course it wasn't an accident. But the background that I have over here is not of Dura Europos. The background that I have is actually from the Talmudic Museum in Katzrin, in the Golan Heights, where you can see, again, all these incredible images where it's modeled after the Dura Europos synagogue. Now, again, what's so special about this synagogue is that it has all these fascinating, fascinating frescoes that date back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. But again, this is a synagogue that might have existed already in the 1st or 2nd century BCE, depending on which archaeologists you ask. And you can, again, see these bright, brilliant, stunning images, all of the period of Tanakh and Midrash. But the image that I want to most focus on is actually this image over here. Because this image is the one that really tells the story that we're trying to tell today on Tisha B'Av. But this is the story of the vision of Yechezkel, the Chazon Yechezkel, the prophecy of Yechezkel, who is a prophet of the Babylonian exile. And after he sees this great Babylonian destruction, he tries to comfort the people and says, all of you who fell for the cause, those soldiers who had those amulets around their neck, all of you who are buried in the various tombs sprinkled all over Jerusalem and all over Judah and all over Israel, God is going to come with his hand, his or her hand, and bring you back to life, resurrect you, put your bones back together. The vision of the dry bones. The dry bones of Israel are going to come together, and together we will rebuild this religion and rebuild this nation. And that is, in a way, this image that I want you to keep in the back of your mind just for a little bit later on in the tour. That the vision of Yechezkel is not about necessarily rebuilding the temple, but the most powerful image is about God rebuilding the people of Israel. And we've now moved along. We've left Syria. This is the Tigris River. We were just kind of over here. And we've now left the Tigris River and we've jumped over a little bit north to go to the Euphrates River. And we're now going to move our way south down through the country of Iraq. Now, where we are on the top right now, this also relates to a previous tour that we were on, which is this is the tomb of Nahum. Now, for those of you who know your good trivia or are related to me, you might know that my middle name is Nahum, so I couldn't pass up a site that's named after my middle name. So what is this Shrine of Nahum? The Shrine of Nahum is a really interesting place. Now, if you look at the map over here, Al-Kosh, the city that we're in, is right next to Mosul. Mosul, which we're about to go to in just a second, is the ancient city of Nineveh. Nineveh, which was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. Now, Nahum was a prophet, not of the Babylonian exile, but of the Assyrian exile. And the Jews of Mosul have a tradition that goes back who knows how long, that they would go up to this mountain that overlooks the city every Shavuot. And they'd go up to the top and they would reenact Revelation. They would reenact the Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah. They even called this mountain Mount Sinai, which is a mountain which is known by the Kurds, the Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike who are all in this area. They refer to this mountain as Mount Sinai, and they would essentially perform this play of what is the giving of the Torah. And then they would go back down to the tomb of Nahum, circle the tomb 7 times. On the 7th time, the women and children would join too, and they would throw fruit onto the tomb of Nahum. And then afterwards, after they would read from the Torah, they would read from the prophet of Nahum, and then afterwards eat from those fruits, celebrating Shavuot. And what's amazing about this shrine is about this tomb is that it has these Jewish symbols on it. This was actually probably a Jewish-built tomb, which probably dates back around 900 years, but the tradition goes back maybe since the time of Nahum to around the 650s, 670s BCE, which is just this really amazing tradition that was there. And now I'm not going to spend too much time over here, but now we've entered the city of Mosul, where you can see what's over here, which is the tomb of Yunus. Yunus in Arabic is Yonah, where this was a place that once was a church. Most of its existence, it was a mosque, but it was always a place that Jews, Muslims, and Christians were all able to go freely and pray and appreciate the beauty of the building itself, but also to think about the great prophet Jonah, who is famous especially for, we read on the Haftarah of Yom Kippur. And because it was a place that was so such a symbol of cooperation between the three major religions, so ISIS purposefully bombed it and destroyed it, and it no longer exists. And you can no longer see, the ancient tomb of Jonah anymore as it stands. And now we're going to slide over to the rest of Mosul over here. And as I spin us around a little bit over here, we're going to see the ancient Crusader fortress that was in Mosul or in Nineveh. And I'm going to play for you a short song that you'll understand why in a second. The rest of it you can try to listen to, or you can find on your own a little bit later on. But basically the idea of we're on the rivers of Babylon, we're here on the Euphrates River, and we're reading the greatest psalm about the Babylonian exile, where, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, that it's this incredible, powerful moment in Jewish history that was the mark that really stays with the Jewish people forever. And of course, but also, and a nice kind of way of symmetry is that one of the images on one of the branches on the menorah in the Knesset today in Israel is this image that's over here of the Jews weeping, of the Jewish people weeping along the rivers of Babylon. And just to provide a little bit of a understanding of this Assyrian destruction is that if any of you have been to the British Museum, or like my Abba likes to joke, is called the Everything But British Museum. So taken from the Nineveh Palace in this area in Mosul, in the British Museum, you can see this huge, massive relief of the conquest of Lachish. You have to remember Sennacherib of Assyria wasn't able to conquer Jerusalem. So he had to come back with something. So he comes back and makes this amazing, huge, and tragic palace wall dedicated to the destruction of Lachish. And you can see here Sennacherib himself, who is judging the refugees, telling them to go into whichever places where they're going to be slaves to. And you can also see the details of the battle in a way, where you can see the battle of the people climbing up the hills, shooting down from the top. You can see images of this gruesome image of death, where you have these Assyrian soldiers that are, in a way, killing the people of Lachish, which this is an image that you could imagine isn't just connected to the destruction from 700 BCE, but maybe you could copy paste this and put this in the Holocaust Museum, and you'd have the exact same effect. You really get the personality of what was happening here. And just next to the people who are hanging, you can see from the sketch, is refugees that they are traveling, that they're leaving from the city of Lachish. You can see them over here a little bit small, carrying all their possessions with them. And just briefly to move on a little bit further from Assyria, now we're in the ancient city of Babylon itself. And for any of you who have been to Rome and seen the Roman Forum, in a way it looks really similar with just how big, how monstrous this city really was. And on the top of the hill, you have the palace of that Saddam Hussein built, that he modeled after the palace of Babylon. Where again, you can just see how huge this place is, the entrance to Saddam Hussein's palace. Again, this is really fun with virtual tours. You get to actually go inside these places. Saddam Hussein modeled this palace actually after what's called the Ishtar Gate, which is the gate that's in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin now. And you can see that in the way he modeled the architecture and a lot of the artwork off of that to be kind of the continuation of the great Babylonian kings, which now it's noted by all the graffiti since Saddam Hussein's was deposed and killed. And we're looking again, we're outside of the walls of Babylon. You can see all these amazing things, but one of the amazing things is this lion of Ishtar, lion of the main god of Babylon. And just next to that lion was found this cylinder, which is a cylinder, one of 5 or 6 cylinders that were by Cyrus the Great, that were written by Cyrus of Persia after Persia had conquered the Babylonians. And on this cylinder, King Cyrus, or Koresh in Tanakh, wrote to the people of the Jewish people, but also to all the peoples that the Babylonians and the Assyrians had spread all over the world, and said, go back to where you are from. I command you, I say that you should go back to where you are from. And that's actually the ending, the final sentence, the thing that the redactors of the Bible, of Tanakh, wanted to leave us with, which is the final point at the end of Tanakh is, go back home. Go back to Jerusalem. Any one of you, of all his people, the Lord his God be with him, let him go up. Vaya'al. Make aliyah, which I'm trying to say to my siblings all the time, but go back to Israel. But the Jews of Babylon didn't. They didn't go back to Israel. A lot of them stayed, or some of them did, but most of them stayed in Babylon. In cities like this, which now is known as Al-Mada'in, but in ancient times it was known as Mahoza. Mahoza was this great Jewish city where you can see what the arch used to look like just about 100 years ago. Some of it's a bit fallen apart, but you can see what this beautiful, beautiful, stunning palace was. Now this palace may not have been just any regular ordinary palace, but it could have been part of the palace of the Exilarch of Babylon. Who's the Exilarch? The Exilarch is essentially the king of the Jews, the exiled Jewish community in Bavel. And one of the famous exilarchs of Bavel is a man that goes by the name of Marzutra II, where Marzutra II, this man that's over here, that's sitting over here, he was so powerful that he actually even led a revolt against the Persians in the end of the 5th century and led to an independent Jewish state in Babylon for 7 years. There's a 7-year Jewish state here. We think about, Hatikva bat Shnot Alpayim, that we've been waiting for 2,000 years to have a Jewish state in the land of Israel. And that's true about the land of Israel. But this is an example of one of a couple of independent Jewish states that did exist in the world. And this one is one of the most powerful states that existed, where Mahoza was also the place of the Pombedita Yeshiva, which was the second most important Talmudic academy. So again, it's that it wasn't just that the Babylonian community was so powerful that was so important, but it was also, this was the center of Judaism. The Pombedita Yeshiva, and what we're about to talk about again now is the Surah Academy, the Surah Yeshiva, is the center of the Jewish world that starts from the Babylonian exile and basically remains the center of the Jewish world for around 1,500 years. That basically until the golden age of Spain, this is the center of the Jewish world. And where we're standing right now is, we've moved now to the tomb of Yechezkel, the tomb of Ezekiel, who we saw that image of the Valley of the Dry Bones when we were at the Dura Europa Synagogue. And you can see the interior and the beautiful architecture from the inside of the mosque that's over here. You can see from the exterior as well, just how beautiful the architecture is, the amazing tower that's on the top. What's interesting about this place is that this, unlike the tomb of Jonah, which was only a church and a mosque at various points, this has been a church, a mosque, and a synagogue, where there was a synagogue from the year 1700 until the early 1800s, after a flood destroyed it, and the Ottomans allowed for the Jewish community in Kafel to build this as a synagogue, which you can see from its, not from this view, but from this one over here, where there's in a way Jewish images all throughout the mosque. And even more than that is all throughout the mosque, there's dozens of places where there is still Hebrew text that is all over the walls of this mosque that's over here. Now, why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because this is the place where the Surah Academy was founded. And the Surah Academy was the most important of all of the Talmudic yeshivot, where even though they were standing on the shoulders of giants of the Mishnah and of the Talmud Yerushalmi and of the Pumbedita Yeshiva and the Nehardiyya Yeshiva, it is the Surah Academy that essentially is what dictates what modern Judaism looks like today. Where if the vision of Yechezkel, the vision of Ezekiel's Valley of the Dry Bones was to resurrect the Jewish religion by resurrecting these people, resurrecting their ideas and bringing Am Yisrael back to life, the Surah Academy is the fulfillment of Ezekiel's dream. And it takes place here where Ezekiel's tomb is, where Yechezkel's tomb is, where even if the Beit HaMikdash has not been rebuilt, but it's this academy, this amazing yeshiva over here that made it happen. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to David for a little study.
Yeah, well, and I think as we're getting towards the end of the tour and we're hearing about all of these places that after exile, where our rabbis and our ancient ancestors had a few choices, right? So choice one was to say, well, I guess we can abandon Judaism. And choice two would be to say, well, then we're just, or we'll die, right? I mean, in certain places, certainly in Jerusalem at the time, it was, well, we can either fight the Romans and be killed, or we can just abandon everything. There's a third option, which is how do we go somewhere else and try and reimagine what Judaism can look like? And it's those ancestors that when they are in Surah or Pumbedita, when they're in these different places, when they're in exile, who try and create it where they create the pillars of the temple and make that a part of their synagogue structure, right? Where we in our Jewish religious lives today, we light Shabbat candles because we remember the very lights that were lit in the temple. We have the wine because we remember the wine libations in the temple. We have challah because the challah is the thing that reminds us of the showbread in the temple. It's how do we actually build lives wherever we end up being? And that's one of the responses that our rabbis take to Tisha B'Av in general. Here's one of the last texts in this section that is all about Tisha B'Av that we read in the Mishnah from 2,000 years ago. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said, Lo hayu yamim tovim li'Yisrael kechamisha asar ba'av u'chiyam kippurim. There were no days as celebratory. There were no days as joyful. There were no days as great as the 15th day of Av and Yom Kippur. The 15th day of Av, the day 6 days after today. What happened on that day? On those days, the daughters of Jerusalem went forth and borrowed white garments so as not to embarrass whoever does not have. And the Mishnah continues to say this was a day of matchmaking. And the day of matchmaking wasn't about how much money you made, wasn't about how wealthy your family was, it wasn't about how beautiful you were. People would lend each other clothes so that you could, in some ways, not actually be able to tell who was in different socioeconomic statuses in their life. And the whole point was to start making matches so we can figure out how to build families and communities for our people. And when I think about what does it mean as we exit Tisha B'Av and what these legacies are of our ancestors who faced exile, is how do we create families and communities and build from there? I'm in a little bit on like a tachlis level. I'm gonna make some announcements, including some really exciting things we're gonna be doing to prepare for the high holidays through the shul. But I know one of the things that is hardest right now is that it's challenging for us to come together physically. And yet, are there ways that we can figure out that we can actually be together in some way? Can we come up with ways for us to be together and celebrate together in a world where that's not always an option? And I think we can really learn from our ancestors from whether it's 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, that there are ways for us to build communities of love and care, even when we are physically apart. And I'll pass it back to Josh.
Yeah, so just to kind of conclude things with just a couple of things. So one is, again, this final image that I want to show you of the tomb of Yechezkel, which is the Jewish community of Kafel in the 1930s, davening at this mosque. At this point, it was definitely a mosque. It was not a synagogue anymore. And it just shows, again, that the Jewish community didn't just survive in exile in Babylon, but they thrived. They were part of the community through and through and were leaders of the community as well. And I'd be remiss if we didn't end our tour of Tisha B'Av here at the Kotel. And why do I want to end it here at the Kotel? Because I actually don't want to show you the Kotel. I want to actually show you this map. This is the first ever map of Jerusalem, which dates back to the 6th century CE from a church in what's called Medva or Madaba in Jordan, where the map of Jerusalem is actually this way is north, to the left is north, which is the Damascus gate, which is over here. And on this side over here, on the bottom of the picture, you can see Jaffa Gate. Now, for any of you seasoned travelers in Jerusalem, you'd know that if you follow Jaffa Gate, follow through the market over here, and do a little bit of a a right-left, and you end up heading down this area over here, what are you going to end up hitting? You're going to hit the Temple Mount. At this point, right over here, this is already the Temple Mount. Even though part of this image has already been lost or destroyed, this whole section of the map should be the Temple Mount. But it's missing from this map. They gloss it over. And why is that? Because after the destruction of the temple in the year 70, the Romans and then also the Byzantine Christians, they had turned the Temple Mount into a literal garbage dump, a mizbeleh. And they turned it into this garbage dump that, to really kind of stick the finger in the eye of the Jewish people that were living here to say, not only is the temple destroyed, but it will never be rebuilt. And we're literally going to wipe it off the map. And this temple that you find so holy, not only is it not even in existence over here, we'll let you go up to the Temple Mount, but only once a year. And what day of the year do they let the Jews go up to the Temple Mount? It's not Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. It's not Pesach, where they could go up and do a Korban Pesach or something like that. They let them go up on Tisha B'Av, on the day that is basically where they can laugh at the Jewish people who are mourning over this destroyed temple that will never be rebuilt. But in a way, the joke was on them, which is that it didn't matter that the temple wasn't rebuilt, because Judaism had already rebuilt. Judaism was already going through a huge rebuilding process from the Surah Academy, from the Mishnah through the Talmud, in order to make Judaism a non-temple-based worshiping religion after that, where it didn't matter necessarily that the building was gone. What mattered was that the dream of Yechezkel had been achieved, that the Jewish people were resurrected back to life. And one final thing before we go, and I'll just give one last little whatever. I wanted to finish with you with a song, which is actually a hip hop song, which David said that isn't really so appropriate for Tisha B'Av because it's hip hop, but he doesn't even know what's about to happen.
Never listens to it, ever. So
this is a band that's called Awa. So this band called Awa is a band of 3 sisters who are Yemeni Israeli. I mean, their grandparents were Yemeni immigrants to the land of Israel and to the state of Israel. And these 3 sisters, as they were starting, they wanted to form this hip hop group, and they ended up starting to realize that they should rap in Yemeni and not in Hebrew, not Aramaic, not Arabic, but to be something really special, they're going to rap in Yemeni. And they learn with their grandparents using their Savta's knowledge of the language of Yemeni, and from a little bit of speaking with her, they really hone their language down, and they start to write all these amazing hip hop songs. And one of the songs that just came out this past year, is called Hanamashu Al Yaman, is about the story of their grandmother from the ancient Jewish community of Yemen, which dates back again to this Babylonian exile period, going into the state of Israel, and the discrimination and the hardship as a refugee that she faced when coming to the land of Israel. And in a way, even though it's about modern times, as you watch and see the words, like as you read the words to the song, you're going to really understand that it's not just about the Yemeni grandmother, but this is about every Jewish refugee, whether it's from the Assyrian destruction, whether it's the Babylonian destruction, the Roman destruction, the Spanish Inquisition. It's the story of the wandering Jew who needs to find a home. to pause it over here. But with that, I wanted to I wish all of you, I guess it's the end of Tisha B'Av for me already, but for you guys, I know you still have some more Tisha B'Av left, and I hope you have a meaningful day. And for those of you who are fasting, that you have an easy fast. And I want to thank you all once again for joining on the tour, and I hope you learned a couple of new things here and there. And again, if you had a nice time, even though on Tisha B'Av we're not having nice times, but if you had a time on the tour, I would love it if you could leave a review for me either on Facebook or on TripAdvisor. Spread the word to different schools or shuls all over North America and the world, so that people know about these amazing tours that we've been doing. You, Anshe Emet, you guys have inspired me to do these really outside the box tours, and I really thank you for that, to really keep on pushing the envelope. And I think I have another tour with you guys in a month or so. So we have one more tour at least to look forward to, and I'll keep on trying to do more creative ones just like this one, to keep on pushing David to keep on having to take me back. And I'm sorry that you guys are gonna have to keep on putting up with me. But with that, thank you so much once again. And again, my name is Josh Hartuv, and you can find me at hartuvtours.com. And thank you once again.
Thanks, Josh. So a few quick announcements. We'll be doing another tour probably in mid-August, doing a tour of Tel Aviv. So that one, you can look forward to that, probably with also some amount of tasting that we should be able to enjoy. Big thanks to Amy, who does so much of the organizing to make sure that we can make this happen. Amy, thank you so much. Again, want to make sure that you're all checking your emails and seeing all the things we're going to be doing. August is going to be a busy month, people. In particular, if you can reserve August 13th that evening we're going to have two big things going on: a Rabbi's Roundtable, where you're going to hear from Rabbi Siegel, Rabbi Chankin Gould, and me about a lot of the things coming up for the high holidays. Also that night, Tanny Prell is going to be running a seminar on racial justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I strongly encourage you to look out for those things. Finally, if you're a member, thank you so much for being a member of our synagogue. A lot of what you are contributing as a member goes towards things like this. And if you're not a member of a synagogue, we're so glad you're here. And if you feel like if you live locally, we'd love to have you as a member. And if you're not local and you'd consider making a donation to help us continue making these programs available, we'd love to do that. Josh and I will stick around for a little bit if people want to talk or have questions. And again, most importantly, Josh, thank you so much for such a thoughtful, insightful tour. I keep getting all these both private messages and seeing group messages. Thanks for a tour that brings so many interesting parts of Jewish history to life. Amy, I don't know if there's anything else on your end.
We're very happy to see everybody today, and wish everybody an easy fast, and look out for all the different programs and events that will be coming your way.
And Dave was talking about membership to the synagogue, but there's also a lot of members of our family that are over here. So if you want to become a member of the family, you can feel free to donate as well. And it helps to keep our family going and things like that too. So
Thanks.
I'm allowed to make jokes. It's not Tisha B'Av for me anymore. So.
Right. Joy, did you have a question or something you were thinking about?
I just wanted to say thank you. It was so interesting. I loved it. Thanks very much for informing me.
Yeah, I'm happy to stay for another few minutes for some questions. Again, I know we kind of blaze a little bit through it, and there's a lot of information, and I wish I could spend 3 more hours with you going through all of the amazing things over here. But
Josh, I think we have a question.
Josh, can I go, David?
Yeah, please.
We've all become members of your family, Josh and David.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, Neil, go ahead.
Josh, those pictures that you showed today, were those pictures that you have taken in these various?
No. I wish.
I would not be alive right now if that was the case.
You just went on, they were virtual tours of different places?
So a lot of the images that I took were from what's called the Diarna Archive. So there's a website that's an interactive map, basically an interactive museum that's called Diarna, Diarna, where it's essentially an online museum of these communities from Yemen, Turkey, Algeria, Tunisia, Iraq, Iran, all of these places, Uzbekistan, all of these places over here. They should use that, and it's an interactive map that you can click on and see what cemeteries, synagogues, houses, Jewish quarters. They have tons of information, tons of pictures. Or whatever is available. Sometimes it's just a little dot on a map that says, here was a thing we think. And
so, for example, the pictures that you showed of Aleppo.
Yes.
we learned, I think, wasn't there a lot of destruction of that city a few years ago?
Correct.
So
The electrical synagogue.
The image that you showed there, was that a recent image?
The main image the main background image, that was the big image that I was showing, is relatively recent. It's from, I think, 3 years ago from Google Maps.
Oh, so that evidently escaped the destruction then.
I mean, it was mostly destroyed. You could see how much rubble it was. It wasn't like it escaped it entirely. And I'm sure a little bit may have been pieced back together by the city. Because again, they do have interest in preserving these heritage sites. Yeah.
Thanks.
I wonder if there are other questions or reflections, things that people found interesting or that they noticed. I mean, I know I love that, seeing the pillars and connecting that back to Tzipori and how the pillars were in so many ways modeled off of the Beit HaMikdash. I thought that was just a fascinating piece that I never would have thought of before. I don't know if there were other things people found interesting.
I'd like to know about the events in Iran where the tomb of Mordechai and Esther was just destroyed or set fire to. Is there any relationship with that and the exiles?
There is definitely a relationship with it because again, with the Babylonian Jewry, they were exiled to Iran as well. Again, modern borders have nothing to do with what ancient borders were. But again, those tombs over there, in the same way that the tomb of Jonah and the tomb of Yechezkel, these are all places that the locals know that they're not just mosques, that these are places that are holy to Jews and to Christians as well. And so when they destroy places like that, in a way, it's like they're shooting themselves in the, what is it, like cut your ear to spite your face, whatever it is. So that is what these extremists do, that it's a holy site for Muslims as well. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all. It's very nice to see you.
Wonderful.
Thank you. It was really very good.
Have a nice rest of your Tisha B'Av. I hope it added meaning to your day.
Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks again, everybody.